one since COVID. And it was a great opportunity to kind of talk about our first IBR's first big conservation effort that took place over the summer of 2021. I don't know what everybody else got to do, probably go to the beach and go on vacation, but here we are down in LA, taking an entire tern colony and making it our patient. So those of you that aren't familiar with elegant terns, they're sleek looking seabirds. Adults usually have pale gray top feathers and white underbellies. Sometimes they also have a little pink hue that's hard to see. But they have these really sweet shaggy black crests that go down their heads and bright orange bills, dark outer primaries, and then darker legs. When this event first started, we started getting all these chicks in, and they noticed that they all had different patterns. And at first, we are making sure, are you all elegant terns? And then after some research, realized that in fact, elegant tern chicks have different patterns. They also have different leg colors and different beak colors. And this is what is thought to help the parents kind of identify their own chicks during feeding. But elegant terns in general are short pattern migrants, so they kind of disperse erratically both north and south of Mexico, and they kind of move in response to prey distribution. So they're offshore plunge dive feeders, really elegant divers, and they're often really seen close offshore. They also breed off sandy coasts and sandy islands in Mexico, and we're really fortunate enough that historically we've had one of the biggest breeding sites here in Southern California. And that's Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve. And if you've ever been to our LA Center, this is maybe about 45 minutes south of here in Orange County. We're in Los Angeles County. And this is a great area that's been kind of preserved for species just like some of the snowy plovers and different types of other shorebirds and birds like terns. They have 2 sandy islands. And what's really great is these are great islands for the terns to breed on, and they're just adjacent to the coast, so the parents can go over, grab some fish, and bring them back to their babies relatively quickly. They make these really shallow depressions in the sand and typically lay 1 to 2 eggs. And what's great is both parents incubate the eggs and end up feeding and caring for the chicks. But keep in mind for future in this presentation, the type of substrate that they're on. So it's all sandy beaches. There's not really many rocks around or anything like that. And typically they're right next to the water. So, they can go in, they can play in the water, they can take baths, and they're really close to their actual food items. So after the chicks are just a few days old, the parents kind of gather them into this like little baby gang, what we call a crush. Again, remember this has been really important for our overall response, the types of behaviors of wild animals, and especially this crush behavior. And this allows all the babies to kind of hang out together. The parents can go out to feed and bring back food. And again, as we talked about, their patterns let the chicks or the parents identify their individual chick. But when they're in this crush, it's pretty much whoever has an open mouth is going to get a fish. And this is also really beneficial to their colony behavior as parents essentially adopt other chicks and help care for them. Now, elegant terns are near threatened, and this is primarily because we're in Los Angeles and Orange County. It's a really urban environment. There's not a lot of private sandy beach space for birds in general to feel safe on. We have a lot of dog beaches. Obviously, it's Southern California. We have a lot of beach goers on the weekends and during the week. So there's just not a lot of great area for them to successfully nest. In fact, the California least tern is actually endangered. But luckily, there's a lot of places such as Bolsa Chica and even places within the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach that have kind of cordoned off these really essential nesting areas. And the least terns can be found nesting with the elegant terns and with the Caspian terns, and they do compete over resources and space, but at least there's areas for them to potentially thrive. We don't do a lot of tern chicks, but we do know from some historical issues that they're incredibly difficult to rehabilitate. So for us, it's really a lifestyle problem. These chicks are thought to spend at least 6 months with their parents post fledging of their nests. Where the parents are teaching them really essential fishing skills. You know, plunge diving can be difficult, so they need to really figure out the tips and tricks to be successful feeders. They also migrate long distances after fledging. So they're a huge colony. They're not individuals. So, you know, for them to be a successful member of their community, they need to be able to stay with their colony. Not to mention, like I just said, there are a lot of them are species of concern because of the nesting areas. There's been some attempts of captive rearing to help augment wild populations, but it's been a fail for many of the reasons that we've already talked about. So we knew going into this that the best chance for these chicks were to be reunited with their colony. We know this because of historical issues. So back in 2006, there's an event deemed Terngate where the workers deliberately washed hundreds of elegant terns and Caspian terns off a barge in the port in order to prepare for a fireworks show. Of all of those birds, 400 died, 24 were rescued, and 20 were released. In 2007, there was a similar human disturbance in the port of Long Beach where Caspian terns ended up falling off of the barge. But we did realize that if done correctly and released back into an active colony, we did have 6 band returns from the Caspian terns in the 2006 event, spotted, banded, being really successful members of their colony. So we know it's possible. We just know it's a whole lot of work, and the probability of these chicks surviving can be pretty low. So the incident. So like I said, down in Bolsa Chica, there's these great sandy beaches where the least terns and the elegant terns were actively nesting. And unfortunately, a drone was flown and crashed into this nesting colony, which ended up flushing both the least and the elegant terns. They abandoned about 1,500 nests, and some of them were active with eggs. And the Caspian terns, the elegant terns, never ended up returning to their nesting colony. Unfortunately, a few weeks later, we got reports of on eBird that there were hundreds of thousands of elegant terns potentially occupying 2 large barges in the Long Beach harbor. And if you can see from my map, you know, the big red dot is where those barges are, and it's downtown Long Beach, so it's a city. It's busy. You know, there's not really any sandy beaches around there. So they saw these 2 large open barges that looked like perfect, very protected and safe areas. And to them, it seemed like a really adequate nesting site. But unfortunately, if you take a look at that picture, what we noticed is that it was just a big barge full of a massive pile of rocks. There was hardly any real estate really available for the terns to nest on. So it ended up being this really overcrowded platform, which was definitely not baby proofed. So this is what we observed. This is just one of the barges. There are 2, and you can tell just by the sound and the amount of birds that this colony was massive. So on July 1st, Bird Rescue actually received 2 live elegant terns from the Long Beach harbor. They were brought in from animal control. They were found on a jetty, and myself and our operations director, Julie Skoglin, actually went down. We tried to re-nest, or at least to try to observe if we could re-nest these chicks. And what we saw were these 2 large barges with terns everywhere. And unfortunately, we also saw jet skiers circling the barges, disturbing the colony. And that, unfortunately, I was able to report to California Department of Fish and Wildlife. But that was our first sense that, you know, this is really happening down there, and it could potentially be an issue. And sure enough, 5 days later, we started getting reports of elegant tern chicks washing up dead along the beach shoreline. bird rescue alumni, Erin Kellogg. She lives in the area. She began to go down, scope out the beaches, talk with the lifeguards. By the end of the day of that day, more carcasses had washed up. So the next day, local wetland steward took his private boat out to kind of help survey what was happening in the port. And that's where we all got kind of looped in and connected on this. His name was Lenny Arkansas, and what he observed was a crowded colony of active youngsters, on these two barges. There was no sides. There's about a 6 to 8 foot drop down to the water. So parents trying to feed the chicks or chicks just being running around, what ended up happening was they would fall off into the waters below. And the average temperature for us down here in July is about 66 degrees. So it's not warm. These babies are partially naked. They're still growing in their feathers, so they're certainly not waterproof. They were actively trying to stay close to the barge. Parents were feeding them, trying to get them out of the water. There wasn't anywhere for them to haul out. It's a significant distance from shore. So they were trying to haul out on these small tires that were affixed to the sides of the barge. And it's important to point out, like, this is a really active zone. There's a cruise terminal just really adjacent to that. The jet skiers, like I noted, a marina really close to. So there was a high potential for really decent sized wakes. So these babies were hauling out on these tires, which is very dangerous because it could easily kind of squish them in between the barge and the tire. So we did see them struggling quite a bit. And we knew that this was going to be an ongoing problem. Fortunately, some of the babies did make it to shore, but a lot were, dying of hypothermia and just exhaustion by trying to stay close to their colony. So by July 7th, we really kind of started realizing that this was going to be a major event. We had rescued 3 live chicks, or Lenny Arkansas, rescued 3 live chicks on the water. And we just started to kind of game plan. And by the end of July 7th, we had 31 terns in care. Our original estimate was 3,000 to 5,000 adults. So maybe 2,000 chicks was our original estimate of the size of the colony. At the end, I'll give you the true size of the colony, which is going to be pretty shocking. But on day 1, we realized that we're going to need some help. We needed to bring in some local and governmental agencies to kind of help assist in this and see how we could help this colony actually survive. So in the end, we had about 10 organizations who directly assisted with all of this, 5 scientists and 3 veterinarians, and some of our partners like the OWCN. We worked closely with MSRC, local wetland stewards is Lenny Arkansas. Without him, like, this was not possible. And then different agencies around here that all came together and all helped out rescue these birds. So we started with field response that was conducted from dawn to dusk, pretty much 7 days a week. IBR does not have their own boats, so the responders that were going out were either privately owned or commercially owned boats, again, with a lot of the partners that joined in. And what would happen is these responders would circle the barges and the waters around these barges and search for chicks floating on the water. They would essentially take nets and scoop them up. There was a lot of risk with this because the last thing we wanted to do was get too close to the barge and end up flushing the colony and disturbing the colony even more or making more chicks fall off. So it was definitely a learning curve. Other issues were just more boat traffic and wakes. We were able to get this into a no wake zone eventually, which really helped make our response a lot more safe for our people and for the birds. And just overall availability for boats was really tricky. So you'll see in this video here, this is one of the methods we used. You can see how close we get up to the barge, but it'll be hard to see. There's a little white fluffy blob in the water that we end up scooping at. And this is pretty much what we did for the entirety of the rescue in order to get these chicks out of the water. So what happened when they came in? What we noticed was that, for the most part, the chicks were okay. They were still pretty robust. They weren't skinny or anything like that. So, but they were very lethargic and cold and wet. So we had to kind of come up with a field triage. What were we going to do to help keep these babies alive before we could get them back to the bird rescue clinic? Um, they came up with the idea of using hand warmers. These things were fantastic, but I ran into a ton of challenges just trying to find them in the summer in Southern California. So we bought out many of the big fives, but these turned out to be one of the most important little trips or ticks that we use to help keep these babies nice and warm. So we would essentially kind of burrito wrap them in a little hand towel, put a little hand warmer in there, and just kind of let them sit in the crates. We would kind of set them all in together because we ended up not really having enough crates for the amount of babies that were falling off. So we would just kind of stack them up, and once they were feeling a little bit warmer, we were able to put them in the crates and get them back up to bird rescue. The transport volunteers would meet us, in the marina, and they would take the babies back up to the clinic. We were generally having 2 to 4 transfers a day, and in less than 10 days into the operation, we had 300 chicks in care. A couple of the benefits was it's summer, it's nice and warm, it's nice and sunny, so it made boat ops a little bit easier, and it helped the babies warm up faster. And just overall, rescuing these chicks out of the water could have been kind of tricky. We noticed that some of them actually had their heads below the water for extended periods of time. So we were able to come up with a method of essentially a resuscitation just to kind of see if we could make this work, where we'd wrap the babies up. You'll see in this video, she just was kind of tapping them on the back, and that's helping the water to run out of any of their air sac and help them kind of bring them back to life, essentially. And it worked. It did really, really well. And we actually made sure we gave these birds kind of extra special love when they came back to the center. So off to rehab they go. As we mentioned, it's really difficult to raise them overall. They require space, specialized feeding methods, lots of time and care. We also generally require special substrates, and we know that they have delicate feet. So the main concern, when this response began was, how are we going to manage all this? I want to point out too that this is 2021. We had just started our volunteer program back up after COVID. So, for us, it was, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get enough resources? And how are we going to make sure that we're doing this safely to make sure that we are keeping all of our volunteers and staff safe from COVID as well? So it kind of added an extra level of, logistics to everything. So some of our initial observations when they came in, of course, they're still somewhat hypothermic. They're wet. They're contaminated, which if you're in a normal tern colony, that's not an issue. The substrate that they were on was pure concrete or rocks. So when they would defecate, normally in a regular colony, all that feces would kind of get absorbed into the sand. Well, here it was just on the concrete, and they were essentially just sitting in their own waste. So they were coming in covered in feces. They actually had feces just like wrapped around their toenails, just because they're standing in their own waste as well. Another major issue we were worried about was aspiration. Did they swallow any water when they fell off the barge? So our initial treatment for them was to go into an incubator. We also gave them all sub-Q fluids just to kind of help get their systems working well again, and immediately start food. We were fortunate to see that most of them were in really good shape. So it's just kind of bringing them back from that hypothermia. Those that were essentially resuscitated were started on antibiotics right away to kind of combat any pneumonia or type of infections. Um, and we were just they were eager to start feeding essentially too. They warmed up very, very quickly, so they were able to progress out of their incubators pretty fast as well, once they recovered, and were dry from the waters. A few of them had miscellaneous medical issues. Again, I attribute a lot of this to the substrate that they were on. So hawk lesions, as they're growing and starting to become more mobile, they're sitting on their hocks quite a bit. So in the sand, that might not be a huge issue because it's soft and cushiony. But on concrete, of course, you're going to get these pressure sores on the areas that you're sitting on most often. Fractures as well. So they were climbing up and down rocks or falling off the barge. There's many ways that one can fracture themselves on that habitat. One of the big ones was fish bones essentially caused these tiny little splinters into their foot pads and their toe joints and various other areas. Again, this wouldn't be an issue on the sand because any uneaten or regurgitated fish would just kind of absorb back into that substrate. But on a barge, they're just sitting there as objects for them to step on. Fortunately, we've dealt with this before with California brown pelicans and some of them coming with thorns from bushes on their nesting site. We know that generally they do really well once you remove the object. So we would take out their little fish splinters and we treated some of them initially. Once you get to a certain number of animals, you switch to a herd health method. So methods we would traditionally do with an individual bird would definitely change if you have 300 of those types of birds. So we were lucky though that we found out that these fish spine puncture wounds essentially healed quite well on their own with very minimal intervention by us. Some of them also had some angular deformities, potentially from being in a cramped space or falling off and having, a small fracture or something like that. Many of these birds also did very well. We were able to give them some pain medication and just kind of treat symptomatically. And the hawk lesions actually surprisingly did really well too, with some time and proper substrate. These hawk lesions, the scabs essentially just kind of sloughed off and left some really nice clean tissue underneath. And we rarely saw any major issues, nor did we have to do much intervention with these as well. So just kind of the unique issues associated with a really poor nesting habitat. So by July 7th, we had 30 chicks. By July 15th, we had over 300. And by July 17th, we had 428 chicks in care. Obviously, a very, very high number of birds coming in a very short period of time. We had terns pretty much in every nook and cranny. We utilized our pelagic boxes. We utilized our duck boxes, our crates, our kennels, and pretty much every indoor enclosure was occupied by numerous terns. As I mentioned earlier, and kind of as a theme, we know that they really have delicate feet, so they can often develop bumblefoot just by being on the concrete or being in some of our enclosures. So we decided to be proactive against this. We didn't want to have to treat or hold birds for bumblefoot, so we started utilizing trays of sand in all of our enclosures, and the birds actually really loved just to stand in the sand. It was a major cleaning hassle, a major expense, but all worth it to make sure that the birds' feet stayed really nice. Fortunately, as I mentioned, they were in really, really decent body condition, so we were able to move them outside rather quickly. We moved them into our aviaries and into our waterfowl pens and some of our outdoor dry enclosures as well. We were initially worried with all that contamination that we would potentially have to wash these birds, but we noticed that they went outside and, like really good birds, took nice baths. After 1 to 2 baths out there, they were waterproof. So that was a really big positive for us, knowing we weren't going to have to wash all these chicks. The feeding evolution was probably one of the biggest hurdles and challenges. Elegant tern chicks are being fed by their parents for quite a long period of time. So we knew that we were going to have to make sure that we were feeding these birds several times a day so they grew up to be nice, strong babies. So we are assist feeding them 3 to 4 times a day. We're going to talk about how the evolution of cut fish to whole fish. Typically, 1 to 2 terns might habituate. So we were worried about habituation risks, contaminating them with the fish oils, just the overall stress of them, sheer numbers, and how are we going to do this again successfully with COVID. And one of the things that I know all of my staff has in their head for the rest of their lives is the sound of terns when you first come in the morning and flip on the lights. It sounded like a colony of hungry babies, to the point where we all needed earplugs in order to not blow out our eardrums. So this is the sound we'll always remember. And so initially we cut up the smelt into smaller morsels, but we realized that one, it took up so much time, and two, it increased the contamination. With cut fish, it's really easy to contaminate a bird that you're assist feeding or force feeding. And after we really thought about it, their parents are bringing them back whole fish, and we were using night smelt at the time, so a really reasonable size fish for any of these chicks to take in. So we switched that up pretty quickly to start force feeding and assist feeding them whole fish. They were going through 50 pounds of fish a day. I mean, these are growing babies, so it was definitely our biggest expense of the whole thing. But we did have a great technique where you just kind of wrap them up in a little towel, and as soon as you put the fish into their mouth, they would actually help swallow it. So this is what we call assist feeding. It's a common thing that we do a lot to many of our baby birds. You'll see here that Jeanette is actually dressed up. As I talked about, if you have a single tern or just a few terns, they can be really susceptible to being habituated. So initially we were all suiting up, masking, and making sure that, the terns weren't associating us with food. But we soon realized that when you have an entire colony at your center, the risk for habituation is much lower. And it was another step that we could eliminate. We still wanted to make sure that we were reducing their visuals and we were feeding them properly so they still didn't associate us with food, but we didn't need to go to the extreme that we normally do. And once they moved outside, we noticed that they started to self-feed pretty quickly on their own. We would stimulate them at first by what we call biffing fish. So it's tossing fish to them to kind of get them seeing the colors and seeing the movement of the fish. I get them really excited. And once, they got excited, they soon started to feed out of the dishes. So it was really fortunate for us the goal was to kind of move them outside quickly so that it would limit the amount of work on us, limit the stress on the animal, and kind of get them progressing through care. So quite hungry little guys. They were fed several times a day out of really shallow feeding dishes. And just like the pelicans right now, it's almost like you couldn't feed them enough. We wanted to make sure, again, that these are growing babies. They need special supplements. We didn't want to deal with any growth abnormalities or any issues associated with them being in captivity. So, tern species can be susceptible to aspergillosis. So we were giving them all itraconazole. Oxalate tabs, which is just essentially a multivitamin. But for us, one of the most important things to give them was calcium. We were going through about 150 tabs of calcium per day. So, once they moved outside, they were getting it less. But when they're inside, not getting the sunlight, not actively feeding on their own, we wanted to make sure that you gave them some extra supplementation. So all this is happening at the clinic, and simultaneously, there's a lot of stuff happening back at the barge. So we essentially kind of split into different teams. There's a clinic team, and then there's the field team, much like you do in an oil spill response. So back at the barge, there's lots of things happening. We know right now that we cannot keep going with taking all of these turns in. There's no way that it's very sustainable. So we needed to make sure we were coming up with different ideas. And one of the initial thoughts was, we want to be able to put these birds back with their colony. So how can we do that safely? And we thought about potentially making the barge a little playpen and putting some netting up around where the babies can't fall off and they can't really get off until they're ready to fledge. But a lot of this stuff proved to be difficult and time consuming and unsafe for our responders. And human safety to us was number one down there. We talked about putting ramps, so if they did fall into the water, they could get up, they could easily get back up, or making some sort of floating platform. There were lots of ideas thrown out. Early on, we tied on some boogie boards, which they for them to haul out onto, which they didn't utilize. So, we were trying to come up with ideas to help get these birds back out safely. Um, Unfortunately, we'd come up with this prototype for a haul out that we were thinking about using for all of the ducklings in care. And that's important to note. We also had about 300 ducklings in care at this time as well. So we weren't slow. We had herons and egrets and regular rehab going on at the same time as this turn response. So we had one poor staff dedicated to all rehab birds. They rarely got any resources, maybe like one volunteer, but the rest of us were on turns. So it was a very busy area. But we took this prototype that we had thought of to for our ducks, and we kind of adapted it a bit. Our facilities coordinator Taylor and a volunteer helped to build these haul outs. They were constructed using boat fenders, pool noodles, hardware cloth, PVC, and then various types of substrate and matting that you guys see in clinic on normal occasions. And what we ended up doing was taking them and affixing them to the sides of the barge using rope and carabiners and a ton of zip ties. And as you can see, the design is essentially like a little raft for them, and the matting kind of cascades off the side. So in theory, it was really easy for them to kind of climb up the matting and get onto this platform area. And it worked pretty much immediately. As soon as a baby would fall off, they would find this little raft and they would crawl up, and they would be able to stand up there, kind of help dry off. It was nice and sunny, and it turned out to be a really great tool for us to kind of. It changed the response quite a bit. We noticed that the chicks were feeding them on the haul outs, which is pretty amazing. And while this was awesome, on the flip side, it meant more birds being rescued and transferred to rehab. I think the first day we had the rafts out there, we got like 80 plus turns in care, which was, I think we were getting like 30 to 40 each day before, but this one, it just kind of switched gears a little bit. By 12 days into the response, we had deployed the first haul out, and then 21 days into the response, we in total had 12 haul outs that were spread over both of the barges. And again, this was great because it gave the chicks a chance, and it gave us a little bit more time to be able to rescue them without them freezing in the waters or getting too wet. But we knew that this was not sustainable either. So, this is one thing I love about bird rescue, is that we just adapt, and we adapt really quickly based on the needs of the animals. And this is a perfect example of us just every day, it was a new plan, what we were going to do. So back at clinic, we had already started to federal and color band all of our near flighted chicks. And we also we got a special permit, not only for the color bands, but to color mark. You can't just do that regularly. You do have to have a special permit for them. So this was for us to really easily see these birds as we were putting them back onto the barge. And we started to go ahead and take these birds back out there to kind of help alleviate the strain on the clinic. And this would give us a way of tracking if those babies fell back off, or if we could see the adults, if they were being, accepted back into their colony. So we would just kind of paint their cheeks and the top of their head and, their upper chest as a way to quickly identify them. But this was a really big time suck. Each bird needed a physical exam, check their body condition. We had to apply the federal band, apply the color band, which is different than our normal techniques, and do the paint marking. So it all took pretty significant time. And it was a trial of an error in itself. The color marking is new for us, so we really had to determine what colors. We were approved for certain colors, but we had to determine what type of ink actually helped. We started with Sharpie markers, and the paint wash or the Sharpie washed off pretty quickly. We had paint sticks that are used for livestock, but that was really oily and stuck to the birds, longer than we would have liked. So we found this awesome stuff called alcohol ink. We were able to kind of paint that on them, and we knew that it wasn't going to harm their feathers, and it wasn't going to last for years, but enough for our resources. And one of the challenges here is that the availability of all this alcohol ink. We probably went to like 50 different Michaels and ordered all this stuff, just trying to get enough to sustain the numbers that we had. We also, as I mentioned, we are federally permitted to band with our aluminum bands or federal bands, but you need a special permit for color plastic bands, much like we do for our blue-banded pelicans. We were able to get these bands in quite a quick turnaround, but those also came with their own challenges. Initially, we started with red, but they didn't have enough red, so we switched to orange, which is not ideal because their legs are orange. But at this point, we were just kind of going to take what we could get. And it was important for us to be able to identify these birds specifically, because you can't read their federal band number from afar, but you can say, hey, I just spotted an orange banded bird, and we know that this is from a specific event, which for us, in our future endeavors is really important. We also generally don't carry hundreds of the correct size federal bands, so we had to kind of rush order federal bands to make sure that all of our birds got banded. It's really, again, a really important for future research. And one of our other big challenges overall was just record keeping and keeping numbers. I mean, it's really difficult to kind of keep all these numbers straight in one of our systems that's not necessarily designed for mass events. So, I bring all these things up because it is definitely a challenge, and there is lots of challenges along the way that we had to overcome. But we were able to package them up, take them back out. We would pull up to the back side of the barge, which had this really tall wall, which kind of separated the colony. So we were able to do it that way in order to not disturb the colony, and then drop the chicks off onto that side of the barge. It was really cute because they're generally very quiet in their cages, but as soon as you would approach the colony, and they would hear the parents and the rest of everybody calling, they would start calling themselves. So it's really kind of a really sweet interaction between the colony. There's challenges here too. Approaching the barge was very difficult and not always the safest. So we had to make sure we were doing it as safely as we could to get the chicks back on there well. But as soon as the babies hit that barge, they ran along the back side of the wall and rejoined the colony. And we didn't observe any issues with them being painted and no rejections. They were accepted right back into the colony and were observed being fed by their parents as well. But we were running short on time. I'm going to say that this was overall 6 to 8 week operation. So just to give you kind of a general timeline of how many birds came in and what we accomplished in that time. But we knew that the colony was thinning, and as soon as those chicks fledged, that the colony was going to start migrating. So we were racing against the clock to make sure we got these babies out. So at this point, field ops evolved again. We started to do actual field exams and banding and marking. So we would bring a table down to the marina. We would set up there, chicks were collected off the haul outs. We did really quick physical exams. Most important thing we were looking for is making sure that these birds have good body conditions. We know that they're being fed well. And we allowed the birds to dry again in the summer. It's nice and hot, so the birds dried out really quickly in the marina, and we were able to mark and band and put them right back out onto the barge. And this again alleviated the amount of birds going back to the clinic. We would only send those with really big injuries or poor body condition back to the clinic. Anybody that needed medical attention, but we did notice that birds fell off 2, sometimes 3 times. So we were able, if they were banded, to record their band, and we'll be able to tell like how many times this bird fell off the barge. And at the same time, the clinic is back there still banding and sending birds down for release. So we were simultaneously releasing birds just collected off the barges and birds that had been in rehab. I think the average time a chick spent in rehab was about 10 days. These are just pictures, various pictures of the different types of release, getting them back out onto the barge. And, as the days went on, chicks and the parents got fewer and fewer. As you can see, this is a vast difference from maybe just 3-4 weeks ago in terms of amount of individuals on the colony. So what the next plan was should you stay or should you go? So the remaining chicks in care, are they ready to be released? We had some pretty standard release criteria, but we knew that ideally, while we might keep some of the birds to monitor for different types of injuries, it was lessening their chances of survival because we needed to get them back to their colony. So we got a lot of chicks out in a really short period of time. This is just kind of a timeline. So you can see we started this early July 3rd. By August 11th, the first barge A, was virtually empty. And all the birds back at the clinic were being prioritized to be released. By August 18th, the last 12 birds from the rehab clinics were actually released and field ops were complete. And by August 23rd, we removed all of the haul outs from the barge. So very quick timeline on this. This is the end of August. Those 2 colonies are completely gone. We worked really closely with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in this. And what was great is afterwards we were granted access to partner with them and go onto these barges and try to get a survey of how many nests. And we were also able to collect any chicks that might have died on the barge. Some of those were unbanded and untouched chicks, and some were banded chicks, but it gives us an overall sense of the success of our adventure. And so when we went onto the barge and both barges and took the survey, I think I ended up saying earlier, we were thinking like 3,000 to 5,000 adults and 2,000 chicks. Well, it ended up being over 17,000 adults and over 8,000 nests and eggs that were counted for both of these barges combined. So this is a massive colony all piled onto these 2 tiny barges. So our final look, we had 2 clinics supporting us. A lot of staff from the San Francisco clinic came down to help. 17 staff members in total, dedicated over 2,000 hours. We had 23 volunteers who dedicated over 1,000 hours to these efforts. Again, 10 partner organizations dedicated over 1,200 hours, 5 scientists and 3 veterinarians. In total, we received 621 tern chicks into care. 516 were actually released from rehab. 1,849 were rescued and returned to the barge. Those are without coming into the clinic. 638 were rescued, recaptured, and returned to the barge. So rescued a couple of times. We were able to band over 1,000 of them, and I mean this band resite number is as of March. We might have some more since then, but we immediately started getting band resites. This will just, I won't go over this too much, but you can just kind of see the overall flow and the peaks and everything of the birds that came into care. Most of them coming in kind of mid to end July, and then being released all the way up until mid-August. So we have band resites down in Costa Rica and El Salvador and Mexico, and then as far north, I believe, as close to San Francisco as well. And we would know this because and it's still on our website now, but you can report these birds. So if you see them hanging out at the beach, again, the spotting, the painting of the birds really helped kind of point them out to your regular bird watchers and organizations. But people were able to report that they saw a red banded or an orange banded tern on some of these beaches. So our next step, we've been working on a formal write-up of this incident. We want to continue to try to survey different colonies, and hopefully that our chicks from this past year will one day be spotted nesting and having their own babies. So we have formed a tern committee filled with IBR staff and biologists and California Department of Fish and Wildlife to kind of help not only continue to monitor these birds, but how our future goals are how we can help the species in general and spread awareness and improve nesting locations in our area, and just support birds in a different way, in more of a conservation way. So if you're ever out Costa Chica or anywhere else and you see a banded chick, just make sure you're reporting them so that we can get a lot of data back. And that's the end.